that is directed to our charge questions. One of the charge questions that we have is question 7 is, are the analyses related to the North Delta diversion facilities appropriate? And does the effects analysis reasonably describe the results? And then in there we have a sub-point, which is, does the analysis of frequency of reverse flows at Georgiana Slough accurately characterize changes in hydrodynamics due to the change in river stage, sea level rise, and delta habitat restoration? And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but we were talking about what the clarification I need is, what do you mean by reverse flows at Georgiana Slough? So when we were looking at reverse, what the presentation said yesterday, we were essentially looking at a node and at what point are flows going upstream, and the analysis was upstream. If you think about, you always talk about reverse flows on Old River and Middle River. It isn't when is the water flowing upstream, it is a tidally average flow upstream. When do we have a net flow tidally or tidally filtered upstream? Is the charge question that was addressed to us wanting to look at when the node is going upstream, or is it when we have this tidally average flow upstream? And also, when you say at Georgiana Slough, do you mean in Georgiana Slough, or do you mean the Sacramento River at Georgiana Slough? It'd be really helpful for me to get a clarification of what exactly is the importance for that.
I can probably help with that since I helped write that. So let me first describe the concern. So our concern is fish that go into Georgiana Slough don't survive as well as fish that stay in the Sacramento River. Right. So our concern is if a fish has made it past Georgiana Slough and they're on their way down the Sacramento River on the good route, how often would the BDCP cause that fish to be pulled back upstream past or in front of Georgiana Slough and have another shot at going down Georgiana Slough? So that's what we're really trying to avoid is an increase or pumping above, at the North Delta intakes, causing a more frequent or a higher magnitude or a longer duration of reverse flows in the Sacramento River that would, because the fish really do follow they generally go downstream, but they also go back upstream a little bit each time. So the concept is try to avoid having them go back upstream past Georgiana Slough and have another shot at going down the wrong route.
And my initial thought on that is that there's going to be two different scenarios to have to look at. You're going to have to look at when the Delta Cross Channel is closed and when the Delta Cross Channel is open, because I think as the system state is right now, it's complicated because you have unidirectional flow all the way down to just about the Delta Cross Channel, and the reverse flow starts right at the Georgiana Delta Cross Channel in general. So the operations of the DCC change where that transition goes from unidirectional to bidirectional flow. And so really the challenge is how does the North Delta facilities, the operation of those, change where that transition point is between this unidirectional flow and the bidirectional flow, as well as what you're saying. But thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I'm not sure we've really looked at that as closely, the relationship to DCC gates to all of these other questions. So that's a good thing to be looking at. Is actually on that topic, and I just had a question from yesterday that I noticed. I wish we had the slides, but Chandra, you showed the slide that showed the early long-term habitat restoration, about 25,000 acres, resulted in a pretty big difference in the frequency of reverse flows there. And then the second half, or actually more than half of the habitat restoration, which was late long-term up to 65,000, was almost right on the same line. So it had a very small additional impact, and I was wondering why that is. Is it the location of that second half, or is it just seemed like if the first 25,000 was going to have such a big effect on tidal power, energy, that why doesn't that second half have just as big of an effect?
I have to go back and check that, Mike, but just my thought is that the incremental increase of the amount of restoration in the Cascades under the late long term is relatively small compared to Susun Marsh and other areas. In South Delta, for instance, there's a large increase. Majority of the increase is in other areas.
That was what I was suspecting, that
Right.
most of that first 25 is right there in cash lieu. So the second half, the second 30 or so isn't going to be as much of an effect. And again, that's in one of the slides I just saw, that you basically based all of this on one estimated version of where habitat's going to happen and when. So it might be good to see how much that changes if you do less there early and more there later and things like that.
So we just to and actually to address that point in one of the comments on one of the slides here, we did do a sensitivity analysis of where these restoration areas would be. So we basically took the hypothetical footprint that we used in the actual effects analysis and varied that by assuming more area in other parts of the delta. We just assume the total area will be about the same, but there will be a different proportions of these areas in different regions of the delta. And we've done some sensitivity analysis, and those results have been reported as part of the AREAS appendix. They have not been directly included in the effects analysis. Is that okay? Your point is very well taken there, that we could take the results from that sensitivity analysis and link it back to the findings in the effects analysis somewhere, just to bracket the uncertainty there.
And I think this is a really great point, is that, and this is something I believe that we said in the phase 2 comments, was that the order in which you restore the habitat is also important. Where you do it, when you do it, and that's why your modeling is very sensitive to where and when, and we're kind of flying blind in our analysis because we don't have that information. You know, if I saw a map, I could tell you, well, of course that, which I'm not going to do, but if I had that map, I could tell you, yes, this area is going to be more sensitive than these other areas, and so as you are progressing through the actual implementation of this, you're really going to have to think about where you put that and what effect that does have on things like reverse flows in Georgiana Slough, because the whole system is linked together.
I have another question, point of clarification. Actually, it's on the same slide, and it's for Nancy. The consideration of the propagation of errors as you serially use models is something that we've dealt with, since the beginning of this process. And I look forward to seeing what you guys have done for USGS. The question I just had as kind of a preview is, do you remember, were these quantifiable values that you could give us, or are these more just consideration, as in acknowledging that it does exist and we realize it, and considering that in terms of uncertainty?
Well, so this is kind of a little background on me, is that so there was Cascade 1, in which I was a part of Cascade 1, and the funding ended on that project, so I went on to work in consulting and then on to Stanford, but I was part of the first Cascade, and then they subsequently had Cascade 2, and so they continued on to that process. So this is more that I need to go back to my colleagues that I had back at the USGS and also look at what publications that they ultimately put in there. But I do recall when I was on Cascade 1 that this was a really big issue that we debated over and over and over again, and we hadn't quite got our head around that problem at that time, but I'm confident that there were some good people working on it, so I'll look to see what I can find in that area.
Yeah, the main reason I ask is that we've tried to ask modelers if we can get some sort of quantification of error in the modeling, and it seems to be very difficult to do. So as a starting point, that makes it difficult to then propagate it mathematically.
So I'm looking at the charge to the panel, and I appreciate that Nancy brought up question 7, and knowing that the panel has a number of other specific questions that I think the agencies did bring up as sort of were inserted into the charge in a manner of sort of some of the key areas that they're hoping to get feedback on. So I know the panel has limited time in their capacity now, but I'd encourage the panel to think about if there are any follow-up questions that you might want to ask the agencies or the presenters about those specific questions as you go off to prepare your report. And then also if there are additional comments that the panel or that the presenters might want to make to clarify anything from yesterday or what's been seen before we just move on.
I guess I have a follow-up question on our treatment or lack of treatment in Chapter 5 of adaptive management, since that permeates so many of the conclusions, especially where there's a high degree of uncertainty. And I guess I would just encourage the panel to provide specific suggestions on how we might do that. In previous drafts of the documents, I think we probably overdid it, and now we've sort of swung the other way and omitted it completely. So there's got to be a happy medium somewhere in the middle. The adaptive management process is described, I think, pretty well in Section 3.6. So save just repeated cross-reference to that section. What would you suggest to acknowledge that essentially the benefits or the outcomes that we can foresee currently now based on current information, we do hope to, of course, improve upon, test and select the best outcomes and use those approaches going forward. Again, without overstating, the benefits that we might be able to get out of these conservation measures. That's the dilemma. So we opted to be conservative and rely on adaptive management, very little in Chapter 5. But perhaps there's a way we could acknowledge it in a way that's defensible.
Just mention just off the top of my head, quick thought is maybe just a section within Chapter 5 towards the end, recognizing the uncertainty and the effects of these attributes and then their overall net effect, and then briefly describing and referencing the other sections of the BDCP on the monitoring that will be going on to address those uncertainties, and then briefly going into the adaptive management framework, how it's going to respond to unanticipated findings. And then, we're referring to the other parts of the document.
Yeah. So Steve Culberson with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm sitting here contemplating the difficulty with which the service and the services and the Fish and Wildlife together are going to have adopting such a program without specifics. And I know that there are other people in other rooms discussing how that might go, but it would be helpful for me to at least, we've talked about some of them today, and given that the Department of Interior has some fairly specific guidelines on how to do adaptive management and what should be in that, and I have yet to see maybe early drafts, but what I think might be helpful would be an example exercise of, for example, the one we were talking about that maybe we have the most information on, and even a start on the modeling. If you begin a program of tidal marsh restoration and you pick a candidate suite of locations and connectivities that are going to be hydrodynamically important, and you discover a third of the way through your first phase of restoration that you've expended 90% of the tidal energy that you expected to be available throughout the course of a 65,000 or 100,000 acre restoration program, what course is now open for the adaptive management program? And so what I envision in my candidate adaptive management program in my head is something along those lines. Like if you discover at a certain point that you're out of tidal energy, you'd better have another strategy for getting at what you think the fish are going to need besides flow. And I'm not sure that I'm real satisfied yet at the level of discourse we've had in the scientific community, let alone in the project proponent and regulatory world, about how that should go. So, these are things that I don't think anyone in this room has solved. And so I'm just trying to think about how difficult it's going to be for the agencies to say, oh, yeah, we've got a plan that we think is going to work, when I'm having trouble even with the most basic of concepts here. What if we, like, for example, what if we expend 90% of our tidal energy in the first 10 years and 25% of our restoration?
I think tidal energy, you're going to be able to model that. You're going to have 2D, 3D models that can...
That's the one that I think is tractable, right?
Right. So I really don't think you are going to get in a case where you're actually going to build something where you're going to be surprised on tidal energy. I think you can have the confidence that maybe not the 1D models, but the multi-D models will be able to show you a lot of what that connectivity is going to look like. And so I don't know if you're necessarily going to get into that scenario, especially with tidal energy.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, so this is a candidate that I think that you could work through an example, because I think you could very quickly come up with a list that would get you 90% expenditure of your tidal energy in the first 10,000 acres. And then the tough part of the adaptive management is, and then what? Right?
Right.
So the adaptive management plan should have alternatives, decision points, alternatives. If we expend 90% of our tidal energy before we're 90% finished with our tidal restoration, then what does the program look like? That's what I'm getting at. So my concern is maybe an emphasis on more detail in the adaptive management part, because all of the things that we've said are deficient. I suspect we're not going to get answers to. So the real nub here for me is the adaptive management plan, and we haven't really started talking. It's not necessarily going to be in an effects analysis, so I get that. It might be sort of outside of our charge here, our scope here. But I think that's the real key to the success of this program. Does that make sense? And the one I choose is tidal energy, because I think that's tractable. And then what? So you've restored 10,000 acres, and they're situated in such a way that you've robbed the system of 90% of its available tidal energy. And I use that term because that's how it makes sense to me. Then what? Now we can't restore things upstream. So where do we go?
I think that's where you have to really think about the order in which you're restoring things, so that you are managed. If tidal energy is something that you think is important, that you need to allocate or budget, then you have to think about that when you're getting into the nitty gritty. I mean, it comes down to you're going to get your hands dirty, and you're going to have to be pretty open about where specifically am I looking at, and adapting it in your modeling. Luckily, tidal energy, it's physics. That's one of the more tractable. I mean, physics is a lot more tractable than biology. So. Right,
and I guess that's what I'm thinking, that the adaptive management plan has to get down and dirty pretty soon. Yeah.
And a rigorous adaptive management plan would have a conceptual model that poses those sort of decision points that are linked to triggers and thresholds. I guess one thing that was a little confusing to me was in the monitoring and research component, which is Chapter 3, I think, the tables had compliance monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, and research, and most of the uncertainties were allocated to research. In fact, it should be sort of explicitly incorporated as a major element of adaptive management to try to resolve those with monitoring and incorporate those into sort of alternative approaches if they pass those trigger points. So in some respects, there's a potential need for a table or a conceptual model, some other diagram that suggests for the I don't know how you decide what the major uncertainties are. There's so many of them. But, the major uncertainties, how would you approach that with a rigorous adaptive management program? What would be the candidate triggers? What would be the candidate thresholds? What would be the candidate alternatives that you would have to move to under that condition?
All right. Are there any additional questions from the panel to the presenters? Any additional questions from the presenters to the panel? I guess I know everyone's been working really hard, in preparation for this meeting, and the panel has been working hard all day. So I could see why we're at this point. I do want to give the public a comment, opportunity to comment if they want to. I have not received any blue slips. Is anyone out there? No? Okay. Well, I would like to thank both the presenters and the panel for all of your hard work. As we've seen, there's a lot that goes into getting to this point. So thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone of the next steps. So the panel will return home, but continue working together to produce their final report, which is due to the Delta Science Program on March the 10th. And our goal is to get that turned around by the end of the week out to the public. So thank you very much for everyone's participation, and check the Delta Science Program website for the report when it's posted. So thank you. We're adjourned.